The winding up of the Idaho legislative session for 2024 is close. It's been a pretty long and grueling session. And there have been a few wins, but there have been a lot of really inexplicably sudden losses that have taken place. And you might think, well, it's just because it was debated and common sense prevailed. And, of course, the public informed their representatives that was something they didn't want. You'd like to think that's how our democracy works, but it's not. We'll explain what I mean here in just a few moments.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Know Where to Hide. Twice a week, I get a chance to sit down and just go over a few places where, let's just say that our legacy media friends may be less than forthcoming with what's really going on. Now, it's not just them. You have a lot of people within the political sphere, too, that like to obfuscate and to shade things in a way that's favorable to them. But we're going to try to cut through some of that smokescreen. Not so much that I'm going to tell you, here's what you need to think, but I'm going to point out that there may be some questions you haven't asked yet, which could lead you to a very different conclusion than what either our legacy media or certain politicians are trying to entice you to believe. Case in point. Why is it that so many good bills, now I understand that's a subjective call, but so many bills which actually limit government or keep it at least restrained to its proper role, that to compel it to have fiscal responsibility and to exercise great caution in spending taxpayer dollars, why do those bills fail so often? And the surprising answer is it's not because they came to a vote. It's not because they were thoroughly debated and this is what reasoned voices in a deliberative body were able to figure out. No. Sometimes it's because one person sitting on a particular committee has the key to either determine whether that bill is going to be heard or not. And in this case, our guy is Senator Jim Guthrie. Now, this is an editorial written by Ron Nate, who is the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And it may seem a little harsh here. What's this Senator Jim Guthrie thinks he's a dictator? Those are harsh words, but wait till you hear what Guthrie's been doing, and then you can decide if that's too harsh of an assessment or not. Here's how Ron puts it. He says, Idaho's legislature is a representative government, or so we thought. Instead of 105 legislators casting their votes on the hundreds of proposed law changes, bills often live or die at the whim of a single stubborn committee chair. Now, this session, Senator Jim Guthrie has taken it upon himself to be the self-appointed killer of conservative bills in the Idaho Senate. He regularly abuses his authority by locking up bills in his drawer, using them for leverage, and or refusing to allow any debates or votes on issues that he doesn't like. Now, if you're thinking, well, that's okay. I don't agree with some of these bills. Well, consider this. Ron Nate says, look, this is wrong. It violates the duties of a chairman as outlined in the rules of parliamentary procedure adopted by the Senate. Those rules hold that the chair should facilitate the work of the committee by setting the agenda and conducting committee hearings. Guthrie's actions aren't facilitating the work. In fact, what they're doing is they're preventing the work. Those bills belong to the committee for consideration, not to the chair. You understand? This is one person standing between the committee doing its job and not. Now, Ron goes on to tell us, do you want to eliminate spending of millions of dollars on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our universities? Guthrie says, no, it must stay. Would you like to see a committee conduct hearings and interview officials on Idaho's COVID lockdowns and mandates? Again, Guthrie says, no, we won't allow transparency on those issues. Do you want Idaho to prohibit requiring public employees to use certain pronouns? Guthrie will have none of it. Are you starting to get the picture? These are just a few of the bills that could have been considered this session, but were otherwise kept locked up by Senator Jim Guthrie. One on gender definitions and rules, a prohibition on government mask mandates, limiting elected officials to one office at a time, prohibition on compelling speech of employees regarding pronouns. I really am sad this one didn't get consideration. Removing Idaho from daylight savings time. That's one I'd love to see personally. Prohibiting excessive ballot harvesting, prohibiting discrimination based on ESG and financial services, initiating an investigation into the University of Idaho's purchase of the University of Phoenix, protecting patient rights. But wait, there's more. How about protecting the right to conceal carry firearms on college campuses? How about protecting all unborn babies from abortion? How about militia's right to public marches being protected under law? How about requiring school boards and councils to allow sufficient public testimony? Canceling funding for any diversity, equity, and inclusion offices in Idaho universities. Do you know how much they're spending on this right now? It's a lot. It's a ton of taxpayer money being used to institute a modified form of racism, one that's more palatable, at least to the woke crowd, but it's still racism and discrimination nonetheless. It's just dressed up in official clothes. Also, here's a bill that could have assembled a committee to review Idaho's COVID lockdowns and mandates, and this one too, inexplicably, well, we don't want to hear this one. It declares a month to honor Idaho's traditional families. Okay, so why is it that he would sit on these bills? Well, I mean, it could be that maybe he's ideologically chained to, every one of those issues, but I think it's more pressure from the political establishment not to take any moves that would change things too much. In other words, that would loosen their grip on power. And that's really what this comes down to. It's all about we've got to maintain power no matter what. Going back to Ron Nate's commentary, he says the Idaho Freedom Foundation encourages Senator Guthrie to find the key to his drawer, release all of the bills, and allow the committee and the legislature to do their work in representing all the views of Idahoans from all parts of the state. Now, the Senate leader, Senator Chuck Winder, should use his authority to tell Guthrie to hear the bills or be removed from his chair. This is serious business, and all the senators should be ashamed of how this game is being played. If there is no accountability, then there is abuse, and it must end. And so Ron encourages each of us to call our senators to get Guthrie and Winder to do the right thing and to end Guthrie's dictatorship. Now, look, even if you don't agree on some of these bills or all of these bills, does it not seem just a little bit unusual that one person can stand in the way of any of these issues even being heard? Does it seem like if one person has that kind of power, that maybe they would be the person to whom certain interest groups would apply pressure? Keep that one under wraps. Don't let that one see the light of day. I know it may sound conspiratorial, but that's actually the way things seem to work within the Idaho legislature. If you've ever attended the Idaho Freedom Foundation's amazing Legislature 101 classes or their more advanced classes, they'll explain to you how those committees work and how that is one of the keys. It's not just a matter of, well, we've got a good bill and, now we're going to get it out there in front of the legislature. You've got to get it past those committee chairmen. And this is a perfect example of how one person can stop good legislation. And, paradoxically, it could also stop bad legislation too. But why do we elect these people and send them to the state capitol to hold a legislative session each year? Okay, they're a representative, deliberative body, and we want them to be able to discuss these things. Discuss them, debate them, beat them to death, and only if they can come up with the proper consensus on it should they pass it. But they're not even being given the chance. It does seem a little bit dictatorial. One person making all the calls, yep, that seems to sound like a dictator. Now, here's another issue that has been before the legislature, and again, this is one of those examples of politicians using fuzzy language to cover up something that normally would be seen as, hey, wait a minute, they're doing what? So they'll call it a rainy day fund, or maybe if that sounds a little too nebulous, we'll call it a stabilization fund. After all, who could possibly be against stability? So the Idaho Freedom Caucus asks, should the government have stabilization funds? Listen to what they have to say before you answer that question. In tough economic times, there's often a debate about whether the government should spend more money to provide assistance or cut spending to reduce the size of government. Yeah, I don't think they're going to do that. From a conservative standpoint, reducing government spending during a recession is essential for shrinking the size of government. Why should government continue to spend freely while families are forced to tighten their belts? That's a question more of us probably should be asking. Now, the legislature recently passed H 685, a law creating a Medicaid stabilization fund. The Idaho Freedom Caucus debated against this new savings account. Now, why would they do that? Because the state already has several reserve funds over $1.2 billion sitting in savings. Creating another fund to save money isn't necessary when that money could be used to help struggling taxpayers. Whose money is it? It's the taxpayers. They're the ones who earned it, not the people trying to get their hands on it and then dole it out to their cronies or dole it out to their favorite programs. They go on to say creating a Medicaid stabilization fund might make fixing the program's problems harder. Medicaid spending has risen sharply by over 90% from $2.45 billion in fiscal year 19 to $4.68 billion in fiscal year 24. So rather than promoting necessary reforms during challenging periods, This fund might act as a crutch, maintaining the status quo instead of driving genuine improvements. Government tends to lean on funds like these rather than making significant changes, which can lead to more waste as well as overspending. Idaho legislators, they tell us, should carefully consider creating additional funds like the Medicaid Stabilization Fund, especially given the state's existing financial reserves. The Idaho Freedom Caucus says priority should be placed on reducing the burden on taxpayers and keeping the government small. Upholding conservative principles means reducing government spending, ensuring fiscal responsibility, and preserving individual liberties within the framework of limited government. The Idaho Freedom Caucus is fighting for those values which are essential for creating a stable and prosperous society that benefits all Idahoans. I know that's really important to say. Well, we want to make sure all Idahoans are being represented. Isn't this why we have the twin initiatives of open primaries and ranked choice voting? Everybody deserves to be heard, unless it gets in the way of what certain people in government want to do. And in that case, you shouldn't be heard at all. Trust us, I think, is what they would tell us. That's not a good idea. You wouldn't trust it coming from a used car salesman. You shouldn't trust it coming from a politician. By the way, here's a great illustration that the Idaho Freedom Caucus published along with this Substack entry to just kind of show your relationship as a taxpayer to the government. The only thing you can't see is the government saying, "Go faster," around a mouthful of food. All right. One other thing, I'm not going to spend time on this in this episode, but we may touch on it in Friday's episode of Nowhere to Hide. There is a huge tempest in a teapot over an alleged incident in which apparently some University of Utah female ball players, were at an NCAA tournament in Spokane, and it's alleged that someone said racially loaded words or phrases to them. And the funny thing is watching people run with this, like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing. On the one hand, you've got people saying this is just proof that hate has found a home in Idaho. And no, not at all. First of all, it's very questionable whether this incident actually played out like we're being told that it did. I mean, you have seen everybody from the governor, not only of Idaho, but also Utah's governor, various legislators. Oh, these so important people have been lining up in front of the camera to express their disdain and how outraged they are, to denounce these horrible, horrific hate crimes done. Look, I'm not trying to say that it's a good thing for people to say disparaging or hateful remarks or even just uncomfortable or ugly remarks. It's not. But at the same time, to sit there and overreact to it and to pretend that when based on very limited information, oh, we know this is a fact, it just smacks of political opportunism. And especially it smacks of, a chance to get in front of the spotlight and to opine. I'll grant you, it's a lot easier to stand up and to virtue signal like these leaders are doing than it is to actually live like a decent human being. Granted, I guess we kind of expect that of them. And by the way, thanks to the Idaho Tribune for giving us some perspective. Here's the evidence we have of the alleged hate crime in Coeur d'Alene. So far, you have one video that doesn't show anything, and it really doesn't. I mean, it's, somebody posted this last night on Twitter, and it was just like, okay, well, here you can see the proof that this happened. And no, all you see is people walking out of the restaurant, and then they walk out of view, and we're told, well, after they walked out of view of the camera, that's when the incident occurred. Okay, so essentially you're saying we have to imagine what happened next, I guess much like the reporter imagined what happened next. But we have one video that doesn't show anything. There are no witnesses thus far. One person, I guess, did file a complaint with the police department. And interestingly enough, normally police won't release a person's name like that when an investigation's ongoing. They release the person's name. Police have not, there's no audio, there's no video. Nobody pulled out a cell phone and caught this on camera. Police have not interviewed the victim. Any of the women of the basketball team who supposedly were the victims of this horrendous hate crime. And no, I'm not being hyperbolic. That's the way it's being described by most news media outlets. Why do you suppose they take that tack? There are no suspects. The agency reporting this has a long history of hate hoaxes and employed Rachel Dolezal. Remember her? She was the girl who pretended like she was black, I guess to score more intersectionality points. And that's just for starters. Now, understand, is it possible that someone was racist towards one of the Utah basketball players? Absolutely, that's possible. But considering the reputation and the ulterior motives of the people who are making these allegations and making them loudly, we should probably verify before we can trust. In fact, the HREI is one of the biggest groups pushing the child drag shows and the LGBT agenda in North Idaho, and they're not very friendly to the Republican Party to boot. So yeah, it's pretty skeptical that they were going to do this, and I have what I think is one of the better explanations. Why did they run with this? Why would they tell a lie, or why would they push this lie? And it's easy to blame the media. I mean, the media sees, oh, this is going to get us clicks. This is outrage. This is going to make sure that people are going to be tuning in to find out what happened. But that's not why this story grows legs, and it's not why so many people are in full caterwaul on social media. I think Michael Herman actually has a pretty good case for why these things have a tendency to grow and to feed on themselves. Now, he's referring to, in the tweet I'm about to show you, Michael Herman is referring to the hoax about, Trump is promising a bloodbath if he's not elected. Anyone who has seen the video in context knows that's not at all what he was promising. That's what he was warning against economically if his policies weren't allowed to prevail, if he loses the election, if Biden stays in. Basically, we're going to see, the ship of state continue to be run right into the rocks. But this is how Michael Herman puts it. He says it's no longer about the mainstream media liars who promote a bloodbath narrative that is a lie. And they did. And they continue to promote it. It's about the audience who craves the lie, who wants to bathe in the lie, who wants that dopamine hit of rage that they live for in the lie. Half the country wants to live in the lie. And so they'll grasp at any straw to try to maintain, see, this is evidence that we were right all along and everybody should listen to us and feel bad and do what we say. Basically, we're all being invited to a great big struggle session. I just want to tell you, you don't have to go. You can laugh in their face and tell them, nah, no thanks. I mean, now, if you are really, truly a racist person, maybe you'd want to go to their struggle session. Doubt it would do any good, though. I've never known anybody's heart to change from, being berated and yelled at. So is it possible that someone said some unkind words? Absolutely. Do we know for sure that it happened? No, we don't. So why does the press and why do so many operatives, ostensibly Republicans, wink, wink, the ones who are Republicans in name only, why do they tend to line up in front of the cameras and want to make hay from this? Apparently, they think it's a soapbox to stand on to draw attention to themselves and hopefully score a little bit more power over everybody else around them. We'll see how this plays out. I have a feeling this is probably going to die out pretty quickly, just again, for lack of evidence. But on Friday's show, if it's still an issue, we'll have some thoughts to share, and you'll get to see just how twisted and ugly and desperate the race baiters and race grifters are to try to paint Idaho as a state. Well, if only you'd let us be in charge, and we told you Idaho's too great to hate. I don't know about you, but as I go about my life, I find people who actually are just very decent people. They have many different opinions. Some opinions I agree with, many I don't. That's okay. But as far as, out and out, racism feels comfortable here. I'm sorry, but that's probably the equivalent of whatever they were spreading on the fields out behind my home last week. Thank goodness the wind was blowing a different direction that day. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.